All right, here we go. Sun just came out, it's in my face. It's a beautiful view from my room, but it is a little bright. So welcome back to the second half of our program today. And it is truly my honor, my pleasure, my joy to introduce Lara Kain as our next presenter. Give me just one moment. There we go. And I've known Lara for a very long time, more than 20 years, I know that at this point. And Lara is an experienced educator, consultant, and national speaker on implementing trauma-informed practices into schools and building holistic trauma response systems. Her experience ranges from supporting classroom teachers to designing trauma-informed schools pilot that is currently being implemented in 20 schools across the country. She's worked as a teacher alongside me and an administrator, putting the science of building resilience into practice. Some of you might remember Lara from a previous Gear Up West conference pre-con session, which was one of our highest rated ever. So we were really excited to be able to ask her to come back today in this new context and talk to us about her work. So we are honored to have Lara here, and I will now turn it over to her. Sorry, wrong slide. There we go.
Thanks, Marcy.
Hey, Lara.
Hi. Thanks, everyone. Nice to kind of see you, some of you. Thanks, Beth and Marcy, for asking me to join you. I'm really excited. I'm going to try and share my screen now so we can move on. Can you all see me? All right. Great. Great. I'm going to close the chat for right now. Okay. So, like Marcy said, I've been doing this quite a long time. And a lot of this comes from my personal experience teaching in an alternative high school, being a student in an alternative high school, and working at the state level, working in urban high schools, rural school, lots of different experiences. And then at some point in my career, about 10, 11 years ago, came across the language around trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And it kind of blew my mind. Like, these were all things that I knew from teaching in a high poverty school and working with students that had faced adversity, but I didn't have language for it. So this really shaped kind of how I moved forward and my work here now in Los Angeles, working in public schools here in LA, and then working with people all over the country to really change our schools holistically with this lens. And so I'm going to try to share that framework with you today. So first of all, welcome. So excited that we're here together. I wish we could be in person. I love to train in person. I'm a real people person. This has been a real challenge for me to train virtually. And I like to build community, be very interactive when I train, lots of like protocols and game playing and up and down and exercises. So I'm trying to mimic that the best I can via Zoom. So bear with me. One of the most important things when we get together is to build community. And I would also say that a lot of the things that I'm trying to model is what I encourage schools to do, right? So building community is a very trauma-informed approach. So building community, building family. So I would invite you, if you are so inclined, to put into the chat, this would help me also, where you are, what your role is, and something about you. So I suggested like your favorite food or movie, but something that helps us get to know each other and become a community, even if it's for this short time. So while I'm talking, feel free to put that stuff, that information into the chat. Oops, there we go. Okay, so here's my essential question. You can see the teacher in me, right? This is where I'm thinking, what am I really trying to answer, to think about? What's guiding my thinking? And along with I loved the theme for this conference because it's so, it expressed very well what I'm hoping to find in schools And that is, how do we create schools that foster hope, equity, and resilience while using this trauma-informed lens, using the science of trauma and neuroscience, neurobiology, things that we now know about what underlies behavior and reaction in our nervous systems and adversity and adverse childhood experiences. How do we take that kind of science lens along with some of the warm fuzzies that we want to see in school buildings and put them into practice? So here's some of my guiding assumptions so that you know kind of where I'm coming from when I talk about this. So from my point of view, we're not here to fix anyone, right? We're not pathologizing, we're not labeling, we're not fixing. We're coming together as a process to make change. This work is deeply personal, transformative work. I think all of us go into this work because we care, because it's personal for us, because like for me, teachers changed my life radically and completely changed the direction in which I was going to be heading. And so that made me want to be a teacher. I became a teacher because of my teachers, right? Many of us have a personal connection to this work. And that change is an ongoing process of inquiry and reflection. So I never quite have it, right? I'm always kind of thinking about this and reflecting on my behavior and reflecting on the environments on which I'm within and trying to have a critical view that is also gentle. I also believe that how we currently operate often induces and compounds trauma for children and families, especially in areas that are impacted by poverty, our BIPOC families. So that is what I'm trying to change, right? Or would hope that our system can change. There's no checklist, program, or toolkit on how to do this. This is not a thing that we do, right? This is not, there's no list I can give you. There's no book I can give you. There's no manual, but there is a framework, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. Hopefully not too overwhelming, but a lot of what we're doing, a lot of the things I'm going to touch on could be 1 hour just on their own. When we talk about resilience or regulation or practices or policies, we could do a whole hour just on those, but I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an overview without hopefully overwhelming you too much. I also believe that our current system delivers more than we can manage, and that most of us are doing our best. I kind of like the way Lucy's trying to manage. That's how I feel most of the time. I don't know about you. But whenever I see this, I think, oh yeah, that's how most of my life is felt in a school building. All right, so let's dive in. In the hope, oops, sorry, this has a life of its own. In the hope that we can try to be a little bit interactive, I would invite you, I have the chat up on one side of my screen, that as I go along, feel free to, and this is just a suggestion, right? But feel free to put a star in for something that resonates for you, an exclamation mark or more for something that you are excited about, and a question for something you have a wondering about or would like to talk about at the end. And we'll try to get to some questions if we have time. And I'll also give you a way to follow up with me if you have more questions. I love how much of you guys are putting stuff in the chat. I love this. I love all the food that I see coming up. You're making me hungry. This is great. Okay. So what are we talking about? There's so many definitions of what trauma is, what a trauma-informed approach is. And I really love this one from Sean Ginwright. And I highly encourage you to read his articles, read his book. He's got an amazing voice in this work. So I love that he defines these also broadly, like as practices that anything that promotes a culture of safety. We're going to talk more about safety and how important that is in a little bit, empowerment and healing. And that positive lens to this, right? That we are also doing this to pay attention to the whole person that's in front of us, whether, adults or youth, and that we are looking at the system instead of just individuals or the individual problems within a system, right? We're looking at this in a very holistic way. So that made a lot of sense to me. I also feel like I've been struggling with this for a long time. I feel like we currently have a bit of a messaging problem in this movement, right? We want to foster hope and healing and resilience, while at the same time understanding that, of course, trauma, ACEs, adversity, poverty, inequity all come to school with us, all affect the human beings that we are at school. We want to be asset focused rather than deficit based. We don't want to engage in toxic positivity that ignores the reality of the problems around us. So many people feel that this idea of trauma informed is somewhat deficit based, focusing too much on the trauma. And so there has been some movement to considering a healing centered engagement, healing centered approach. But the problem is the messaging, right? No one knows, when you say that, no one knows what you're talking about. If you say trauma informed, people are like, okay, I know what that means now. Like we finally, after all these years, are finally getting traction with this movement. But I think there's a struggle with the language that we use. So I'm still going to say trauma informed, but really we are trying to move more towards healing centered engagement. And what does that mean? So a shift to healing centered engagement, and this comes from an article written by Sean Ginwright, like I mentioned before, and I put the link in there for the future, you'll have access. So this really, again, focuses on an individual's strengths, recognizing their resilience without minimizing the impact that the trauma may have. And expands this idea to a more holistic approach that fosters well-being in an environment. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. And I love this part because we always, when I first learned about trauma-informed care, it was shifting to this question of, instead of what's wrong with you, to what happened to you. But now we've really evolved even beyond that to what's right with you. I love that. I love that that focus on our strengths and the assets that we bring to the room and what our youth bring, especially, I mean, having worked with kids that have had a lot of adversity, they bring so much to the table. They bring so many strengths to the room that are often gone unrecognized for being strengths. SAMHSA says, that trauma can be looked at as an event, series of events. I do love this definition because it does bring in community, not just the individual. And I really do believe that that is true, that it, of course, isn't just trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is part of our community and our environment. And it's also important to recognize the effect on the nervous system, because we're going to talk about regulation in a little bit, that it's not the intensity of the circumstance itself, it's individual, right? How we all interpret an event, make meaning out of an event is individual. What's traumatic for some is not traumatic for others, but it affects our nervous system. And regaining control in that moment is what's really important. So when kids can be triggered, or adults, right? We don't know necessarily what's going on behind the behaviors that come out of that, but helping them to regulate and feel safe and come back down to a place where you can talk is really the core of what we're trying to do in the building. And of course, right now, right, we have something else. We have this added layer of COVID and collective trauma. We're all experiencing trauma on some level. And in some ways, it's been interesting because I do feel like there's been almost an opportunity, because so many are experiencing trauma there's like an interesting, I don't know how to call, maybe an empathy window. I heard one person describe it that way, right? That people that may not have been interested in this conversation about how to change our school environments to be more trauma aware, trauma sensitive, responsive, are now more interested in hearing this conversation after a collective experience of trauma. And because of this collective trauma, I mean, of course, we know that it is a hard time for many people. And additionally in California and in Washington and Oregon, we've also had wildfires, right? So we've had all these multiple collective traumas on top of what we were experiencing, as well as, you know, there's been a political trauma, there's been a lot of dysregulation, there's been, you know, civil unrest across the country. We've had a lot going on in the last 6 months that has been collectively a lot. And of course, as educators, we're also human, right? We have our own trauma histories. And so we are often emotionally impacted by the trauma of our students more significantly. When people say toxic stress, it's more ongoing, right? More prolonged. And what I really wanted to emphasize here was this absence of the buffering protection afforded by stable responsive relationships, because that stable responsive relationships is another big key part of being a trauma responsive school setting. The language around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, has also really expanded over the last few years. Rather than just looking at what might have happened to an individual in their home and childhood, we've also begun looking at community adversity. So, right, the roots of that trauma and adversity, looking at violence and poverty and racism and historical trauma, lack of jobs. And then also we've added another layer of environment. So, like I said, wildfires, hurricanes, things that have been that are often disproportionate in how they affect communities as well. When we think about trauma in the brain and understanding how all of us, but we're talking about our students, but all of us process from the bottom up. And so all of this is affecting us. First, we're thinking about, am I safe? That's the very first layer. So our brain system, our nervous system, is constantly scanning the environment to determine levels of threat and safety. And so kids want to know when they walk into a classroom or into a school building, am I safe? And then the next question, and this happens unconsciously, right? Am I loved? Do I belong? Am I in community? And then last thing, the very last priority for the brain is, what can I learn from this? And that higher level order of thinking. So we have to pass the first two tests before we can get to that higher level order that we want when we talk about academic achievement and success. First, we have to conquer safety and belonging. Thinking about it this way, that if we don't do it that way and we only focus on academics and don't address that bottom-up thinking, which is what we like to call it, bottom-up thinking, that we're asking kids to focus on academics while they're trying to play chess in a hurricane. I love the way that this is described, because that is what you can sometimes see happening in front of you. Kids are trying to make sense of what you're asking them to do, but they've got too much else going on to be able to really focus. And so then they act out in all sorts of ways, or shut down, right? Love that from Reggie. How does implicit bias impact the child's brain? Yes, and we're going to talk about that more as we go forward, but absolutely, racial trauma is trauma, right? So it affects them in the same way that they experience other traumas, 100%. So one of the activities I often do when I'm working with people in person, kind of play popcorn creativity, is to get you thinking about this outside of your linear brain. And to think about this, how is trauma like an oak tree? And I just invite you to put in the chat, what comes up for you when you think about that? In what ways are they similar? How can we get to our creative brain? Deeply rooted, layers, yes. Has roots you can't see, love it. Keep it coming, absolutely. Branches out, yes. And it changes, but it's also strong. I love this. Yeah, there is a strong foundation. And it's old. There is generational, historical trauma that is embedded, absolutely. But there's also the possibility of resilience. Yes, yes, love it. You guys get it. And this kind of activity, people are often asking me, like, specifically, what, give me examples of a trauma-informed teaching, activity. This is one, because there are no wrong answers. It invites knowledge that kids bring to the room, or adults, right, that you have. It asks us to get creative. And it's validating. I love it, you guys. This is great. Thank you. I love that you're getting in there and participating. So for a lot of folks, this is a big paradigm shift, right? We're moving from an old way of thinking about schools and schooling and what is the meaning of school and what are we here for, to a very different idea. And this pendulum has gone back and forth over time. And we do have history way back in the late 1800s with the progressive movement and Dewey and Maria Montessori that looked at the humanness of learning and how we learn, project-based learning. A lot of that has roots way back then, but we kind of went all the way this other way to zero tolerance and very prescriptive high stakes testing. And now I feel like we're kind of somewhere moving back towards that. Yeah, I see both too. I see the rabbit and the duck. I don't know what that means about us, but right. Awesome, you guys. So like I said, we're kind of progressed in these kinds of questions that we, at first it was kind of when kids would act out, what's wrong with you? To, all right, there's something underlying that behavior. What happened to you? Now we're kind of thinking, okay, what might you need and how can I help? So this is another kind of just reflective question. How do trauma and ACEs impact the school communities that you're part of? I'm guessing they do a lot. And how do your school communities address this? What creative ways, what good ways, or some people say not at all, but usually there are some ways that schools are starting to be able to address this. Yes, collaborative problem solving. Ross Green, huge fan. Absolutely. When we talk about ways that schools have begun to reimagine discipline, we'll talk about that as well. When I first saw this quote, I saw it somewhere else. I didn't make this up. I was like, yes, 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 right? So this is how I felt teaching kids who'd had a lot of trauma and hadn't healed, right? It just comes out all over and often directed at you, especially if they feel like you're a safe person, right? It just comes out. And realizing that we need to create environments that help people heal. And that we can't shy away from this idea of healing. Like in the beginning, we were talking about healing-centered engagement, right? The healing part, we can't skip over. So sometime back, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration, the federal government, came up with these 6 pillars of trauma-informed care. And when they first created them, they were really thinking about clinical settings, right? Mental health is where a lot of this language started. And so they said that a trauma-informed environment prioritizes safety, trustworthiness and transparency, encourages peer support, has set up an environment that fosters collaboration, really thinks that empowerment and voice and choice are vital to include, and also has intentional awareness to cultural, racial, historical, and gender issues and justice. So this is what I typically do with schools when I'm in person, right? And I've even done some virtual workshops this way, where we take all 6 of these and try to translate them into a school setting. So this is the framework that I really want you to take with you, because like I said in the beginning, and this is so true, and don't let anybody tell you different, there is no playbook, there is no checklist. That this is deep, transformative, structural, complex, messy work that takes many years. We're talking about deep cultural change in a building. Using this framework is very helpful because we also need something to guide us, right? We need a North Star. And so looking at what are we doing in our buildings, in our classroom, in our counseling sessions, in our gear up, right? What are we doing within our locus of control that promote safety, that build trust, that peer support can look like both adult peer support, like co-teaching, having a buddy where you can tap in and tap out when you start to lose it, collaboration. The one thing I see consistently across schools that are doing this well is high levels of effective collaboration amongst adults. So most of the work that I do with schools is really around adult behavior. I'm not there to fix kids or fix youth behavior, right? It is around building safe communities, modeling this work, building a culture that embodies these 6 pillars. So I invite you to think about that. And if you can follow up with me on like how I've used this with staff and how you might be able to use this with your staff, to think about where you are on this spectrum and what that might lead you towards. They also came up with this as a little bit shorter, right? Another way to think about this, but it has the same themes. Are we creating a safe environment? Are we explicitly building relationships and connectedness in everything that we do, our lessons, our teaching and learning, right? Everything. This is not just for the student supports staff. This is everybody rowing in the same direction. Are we supporting and teaching emotional regulation? This is where a lot of the really highly effective SEL curriculums come in, right? And teaching kids about their feelings and how to express them in healthy ways. I'll give you a couple examples. So this is one. Youth voice is huge for me. And that is, of course, one of the, part of one of the pillars, right? Is voice prioritized. And researchers have actually found that well-being, if we want to cultivate resilience and well-being in young people, that they have to have some function of control and power in their school and communities. In so many schools, kids have very little power and control, and they try to seek it out in different ways. So the more choice we can give them, the more feeling of being active in their community by being free to have school walkouts if they want to protest injustice, right? Within safety. Like I've had some amazing schools here in Los Angeles be able to facilitate that with youth when they've felt the need to walk out and protest something, and they called in parents to chaperone, and they did it in a way that was safe and gave kids agency. So we can't underestimate the power of youth voice as we're trying to build well-being and resilience. And about safety. So like I said, remember that brain order, right? Safety first. We have to feel safe. All of us. This is a human need. We must feel safe in our environment to be in that optimal state for learning and social engagement. And the more unhealed trauma we have collectively or as an individual, the more we need cues of safety in our environment to regulate. So school environment, the physical environment is super important. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I walk into a school, I know in the first 5 minutes what kind of culture I exist in. I can feel it. And so cultivating that, and it's not something I'm looking for, right? It's that those internal cues of safety where my body says, this is a warm, safe, welcoming environment, and I'm excited to be here. So we want kids to walk into buildings and feel that. So it's, for me, this trauma-informed approach is the lens through which we view our entire system. It's not a thing that we do. It's not another initiative that we layer, that we silo. It is who we become and the lens through which we look through everything. So how do we do our budget? Is our budget aligned with trauma-informed principles? How do we hire people? Let's look at our interview questions. How do we do our discipline? Some of you already brought up like collaborative problem solving and restorative justice. Yes, yes, and yes. How do we do all the things that we do in a school building through this trauma-informed approach? And we have to meet our kids' basic needs. We know this, right? We can't get to that higher order thinking without paying attention to their basic needs. For those of you that haven't had a chance to read Paul Gorski's new article in ASCD, I highly recommend you read it. It's called How Trauma Informed Are We Really? It's short and it's excellent. And I love this clip, and I just quoted him because I couldn't say it any better, right? Just that if we are not being explicitly anti-racist, it's not trauma-informed, because racial trauma is trauma. And that trauma-informed practices are rooted in anti-racism and anti-oppression, not just in looking at that isolated traumatic event. And if I'm not actively anti-racist, I'm not trauma-informed. So I put the link down there. I highly recommend the whole ASCD publication this month is about trauma-informed schools, but this was really the best article. Yeah, his work is fabulous if you haven't come across him. He's wonderful. So these are from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and these are a little bit old, but I wanted to share them with you because, again, almost every time I do this, people are like, give me specific things to do, right? So I'm going to try to share with you some specific things to do. So greeting students warmly at the door. Easy to do, doesn't cost any money, right? Taking that time, people are worried about the time that we take to do these things is taking away from academics, but I'll say it again and again until you're sick of hearing it from me. We can't get to the academics until we do these things well. It takes longer to get to the academic parts if we don't pay attention to these. Oh, I love that, right? Greeting them when they enter in the Zoom, even if their camera's not on. Yes, so adapting this to our new reality. Absolutely, I love that, thank you. Giving them choices, remember that framework, choice, voice. Giving them any opportunity that you can to control parts of their day. Have that feeling of agency, praising them publicly and discussing concerns privately. I was kind of surprised at how often that's an aha for people. Like I had some teachers be like, oh, I shifted all of my concern conversations to private, and it, completely changed the relationship I had with my kids. I was like, yep, definitely. But also setting clear, firm limits. Kids still love boundaries, need boundaries, right? It makes them feel safe. Providing them safe places to talk. Some kids, being sensitive to potential environmental triggers, and warning them when unexpected changes might be coming up, having plans for transition time, just reassuring that kind of, that it's not them, they're not bad, they might be feeling dysregulated and making a maladaptive choice, but you got to put that, of course, in kid language. And then incorporating large muscle activities. And I think we forget this as kids get older, but we all need this when we're learning, right? We all need to be able to get up and jump and run and do things like that. And this is from another good book, Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students. They have a new version out. And they talk about empowerment. This unconditional positive regard. I don't know how many of you have seen Rita Pearson's TED Talk, Every Kid Deserves a Champion, but to me, that is the best resource that speaks to that feeling, right? Even if you have to fake it till you make it, that all kids need to feel this unconditional positive regard. It is a game changer if you can do it. Even if you are struggling to like them, right? Maintaining high expectations still, because I think there's this tension that exists in schools. Schools want to become trauma informed, and they go so far to the side of being accommodating and warm and fuzzy that they almost, what we call like the pobrecito effect, right? Like, I can't expect anything from these kids because look what they've been through, right? That's not what we're saying. There's a tension. There's a balance. Check assumptions, observe and question. So sometimes behavior is the only way to communicate. And be a relationship coach, especially teach how to have healthy relationships. I found this to be true, especially with older kids. They really didn't have any good models of how to handle conflict in any kind of healthy way. And then, you know, as often as possible, providing opportunities for them to participate meaningfully and authentically. So right now, more than ever, it's so important that we go into this school year, even though I know it's already, you know, we're partway through the quarter into it, but ample opportunities to regulate, relate, and build community and ease into academics. So again, from Sean Jin, right? So, oops, sorry. Go back. Elimination of exclusionary and hyperpunitive discipline in a trauma-informed school. So there are a lot of ways that this looks like. Some people already mentioned. Transitioning into restorative justice approaches using collaborative problem solving from Ross Greene, looking at their behavior, the disruptive or shutdown behavior, as a symptom of something else going on underneath that. It's a communication to us that we need to figure out and figure out what they're trying to tell us. One of the tools that I'll leave you with when we were talking about this framework is, I think another part of becoming a trauma-informed school is the willingness to review our policies and procedures with a very open mind using this framework, right? So does this policy, whatever it is that you're looking at, does it promote safety? And it gives you some guiding questions, and then it gives you a way to rank it, and it gives you a place to cite evidence to support that. But I would also say that if you're willing, if your leadership team does this, you have to be willing to work towards exiting policies that are re-traumatizing kids. So if you have a rigid discipline matrix, if you have zero tolerance policies, and you determine using this matrix or this type of review tool that it is not trauma-informed and is causing harm, that you're committed to making it go away. I would just also give a shout out to the Wisconsin Department of Instruction, which is where I got this tool from. They have an amazing set of tools for this work. You do not have to start from scratch. They have free online modules for teachers to do training. They have all sorts of, they have like a regulation plan for kids, kind of like an individualized regulation plan of what kids can do when they get upset. They have all sorts of great tools. I highly recommend you go there. Free resources. All right, so I said we were going to talk a little bit about regulations. You can't talk about all of this without talking about regulation. And I love Dr. Bruce Perry. Hopefully you're familiar with him. If you're not, become familiar with him. But he's really been one of the folks understanding what happens in our nervous system and in our bodies and our brain as we experience trauma and need to heal from it. So the 3 R's, which have to be done in this order, are first regulate. So bringing our nervous system back to a place of regulation and safety. Then we can connect and build community and relate to a student. And then only then can we get to the reasoning part. So remembering regulation, relationship, and then reason and reflect. They can't do the reason and reflect without the other 2 first. And it also means that we need to know how to regulate ourselves. So like I said before, most of the work that I do is with adults. So how do we know what our own triggers are? We all bring baggage, right? We all have stuff that trips our trigger. And how do we know what that feels like in our body when that starts to happen? And do we know how to regulate ourselves in that moment? And that takes practice, lots and lots of building muscle memory. It took me a long time to learn, right? So, and I still get it wrong all the time with my own kids. I yell at them before I stop and think and breathe and all the things I'm supposed to do before I react, right? But we're trying to train ourselves to respond and not react. And like I said, each of these, like regulation could be a whole hour in itself. This comes from a principal friend who also does training around the country. He's wonderful. Realizing that what's behaviors coming at you isn't about you. Usually, right? Almost never is it about you. Don't take it personally. But also be able to empathize with them is crucial. So when we have a healthy nervous system, this is for all of us, right? It is normal to have these kind of ups and downs. We get a little bit stressed out, we settle ourselves, we go up again. And we stay within this realm of healthy, regulated nervous system where we can process and learn. So this is another way to look at it, right? So in that squiggly line is what I just showed you before. This is when we are in the realm of social engagement, joy, groundedness, learning, curiosity. This is when all those things happen that we want to happen in a classroom. When we start to get activated, we start to rise into that fight or flight, and then we can hit overwhelm. So we see kids with their hoods down, face on the desk, right? They are disassociated, shut down. So teaching kids explicitly how to regulate themselves, giving them opportunities to do so, modeling it, regulating ourselves is really the essential first step in having a trauma-informed classroom or school is regulation. Because remember that hierarchy, regulation, relationship, and then we can reason and reflect. And when has it ever worked for you to tell someone to calm down? But we say it all the time, right? But that's a cognitive message. What we need is for our bodies to calm. And to do that, we can't think our way out of a dysregulated state. We have to do something to regulate our bodies. So sometimes that's running or jumping jacks or, taking a kid out to the playground to walk laps until they calm down. It's all sorts of different ways that you can think about how we might regulate a nervous system. And like I said, just to emphasize that if we are dysregulated, we cannot help regulate a kid. So we have to regulate ourselves first, and then we can help them regulate. So we also want schools that foster resilience. In one way, this is one definition, there's many, right? Managing stress and functioning well when faced with stress, challenge, and adversity. And we hope that the outcome is personal growth and positive change. It's also, it's a process, right? And an outcome. We want people to come out on the bounce back resilient. So everyone has the capacity for resilience. Some people have a pattern throughout their lives where they can, kind of go up and come down and go up and come down. Others have periods where they're more resilient than others. And that resilience is always relational. It happens just like harm happens in relationships, so does resilience. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child is an amazing, amazing resource for this work. So if you want to learn more about the science of resilience, I highly recommend that you go there and look through their website. They have videos, they have all sorts of great tools to share this with other people as well. And all of their research is really boiled down to these 4 things. When they look at, you have 2 kids that went through the same thing. One didn't do so well, and one really was able to overcome. And that is having a supportive adult-child relationship outside of their parent. So their parent and another adult, right? Building a sense of self-efficacy and perceived control. I can do this. I am effective at this. I can control some of what's going to happen to me. Providing opportunities to strengthen their adaptive skills and self-regulatory capacity. So that's kind of what we were just talking about. Can they self-regulate? So practicing that means that they experience some kinds of stress, right? A little bit here and there. Thanks, guys, for putting that in the chat for me. And then mobilizing sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions, whatever that looks like for a family and community. So learning to cope with manageable threat is critical for the development of resilience. Think of it like a muscle, right? So we want to practice that. We don't want to completely shield them from little bits of adversity. When they're young, they have to learn how to cope and regulate. It's an adaptive skill. And what I really love about their research is that it can be strengthened at any age. So often working with, overage, undercredit kids, they were like, why are you working with 17 and 18-year-olds? It's too late. I was like, no, don't say that to me. I don't believe that's true. Well, now the science proves that belief, right? That this can be strengthened at any age. So I also want to say what resilience is not, because resilience, the word, carries also a lot of baggage with it, right? So being resilient doesn't mean that people don't experience that stress and emotion and suffering. It's definitely not that idea of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. Grit, right? No. Right, Reggie, right? We have to take into account how racist systems play a part in this. It's not grinning and bear it in the face of unjust policies and inequitable systems. It doesn't mean that we just accept things the way they are. That's not resilience, right? Focusing on personal resilience, or like that word grit, right, avoids the structural problems that cause that suffering that require resilience in the first place. So I want to make sure to always talk about that when we're talking about resilience, because I think that's really crucial in what we're dealing with, especially in our current world, but always, right? That this doesn't mean that we accept and are resilient in the face of inequities. So especially in the roles that you guys have, right, as a lot of you are student support folks, over and over, all of this research from all these people that we talked about, it really comes down to this important thing, that building resilience is a positive relationship with one caring adult. Think for all of us, for most of us, right? I won't make assumptions. There is one person in our lives who made all the difference. Grandparent, teacher, coach, pastor. So reflect on that for yourselves too. And like I said in the beginning, that's why a lot of us got into this work. There is one person who changed our lives through that adult-child relationship that we want to be able to give back. And that also puts a lot of pressure on us, which is why my breakout is on self-care, right? Yes. Feel free to put in the chat who that person was for you. Thanks, Marcy. Yeah, absolutely. So I also just wanted us to pause and reflect. Yes, thanks you guys. Put this, I'm going to move this actually back while you guys are putting that in there, because I love that you all are being able to reflect on that, because it's so important. So for me, kind of like I was saying earlier with that empathy window I've experienced during the pandemic where people are more open to this conversation, I've also experienced that in the same way when we talk about some of these past policies and practices that I think do harm and that I'm wanting to change for a very long time. So for me in the past, whether I was working at the State Department of Education or in my own school, I've advocated for grading that is based on mastery and equity. And I've encouraged schools to think about flexible scheduling and making sure that they have curriculum that is inquiry driven and adaptable and flexible and culturally relevant. And all of these things, getting rid of high stakes testing. And then all of a sudden, when schools shut down in March and by the end of April, many of those things had happened. So I was always told, like, you're such an optimist. Yes, research backs up all those things that you're saying. Because I was like, that's towards building a trauma-informed school, right? These things are working towards doing no harm and encouraging hope and healing and authentic being in a building. So then all of a sudden, we now have high stakes testing went away, overnight? We have flexible scheduling. We have curriculum that has become more adaptive. There's all these things that kind of happened all of a sudden that I felt like, oh, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe we actually have an opportunity to really reimagine what we go back to and how we design things when we return. So I'm still holding on to that hope. And that I just, this is another way, a window for you to pause and reflect that since March, what ways have we begun to redesign or reimagine our education system, and how are these practices aligning with the trauma responsive schools best practice? Remember those six pillars as a framework. How do these align with that, and what opportunity do we have to make that happen? I think about that a lot right now. And I'd love to hear, what has come up for you in that way. So this is not a complete list because there is no list, right? But I was trying to think of, especially within the framework of your conference and the goals and the message, what do I see when I walk into a school that's on its trauma-informed journey? What are some of the things that I look for? What are some of the things that I see them working towards? So, right away, I notice what kind of discipline practices they have. So they have, because, I walk into a school that says they're trauma-informed, but they still have a rigid discipline matrix that doesn't allow for nuance. And then, that's something to think about because that doesn't really fit with the framework. So they are using restorative practices and flexibility and understanding behavior underneath behavior and trying to pause and show concern and attempt to discover what lies beneath the behavior, because behaviors are going to occur, right? Of course. Pause judgment, right? That's letting go of our assumptions of why people are what we think they're choosing to do things or not. I want to see that these schools are actively anti-racist, supporting their LGBTQ plus students. They're committed to equity for all. You can see that, you can feel it, you can hear it. that the school feels warm and safe, right? That is the one key message from today. And using hopefully some kind of distributed leadership with adults. They have high collaboration amongst adults, like I said before. And they prioritize a curriculum that includes inquiry, cultural relevance, and youth voice across no matter what grade level. They are grading with mastery, growth, and equity at the center. Ideally, no grades. I'm a big advocate of no grades, just feedback and rubrics. And we're getting there, right? I've seen some of that movement since March as well. Building a culture of community and family. So I see them having regular activities in classrooms and as a whole, where they are constantly taking advantage of chances, to build community. They are using a bottom-up approach, like we talked about with regulation, right? That means providing opportunities for regulation, bottom up, regulate, relate, then reason and reflect. Joy and laughter are evident. So I want schooling to be joyful and fun. And I think especially in high school, we lose that. We forget to prioritize joy. But of course, we all need it, right? We need it at that level as much as anywhere. And of course, like the best way I could sum it up, you guys had the best words for your conference: promoting a culture that nourishes hope, is committed to equity, and fosters resilience. And it's going to look different. There's so many different ways to do this. Across school systems. I'm just quickly looking at the chat here. This is great, you guys. Yeah. So I hope that we can take this opportunity to seize the window that we have. I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm still holding on to the fact that we won't go back to the broken normal that we had before, because it wasn't working for kids. So many kids were pushed out of the system, right? So I want to go back to a better normal. I know that word is becoming overused, right? But I don't want to go back to what we had. And I want us to take this chance to using this trauma-informed lens to rebuild a better system that addresses the needs of all kids and adults. Adults are suffering in buildings, I'm telling you, across every school, right? We need to have a good place, a good environment, a good culture for everybody. So with that, I will leave it open. We have a couple minutes. Oh, good. Good timing. A couple minutes for questions if you have any. Yeah, and I just, the word that just keeps coming up, like Kelsey, you said, like staff and students and parents. I'm a parent of two 16-year-olds. Yes, I feel it, right? Is grace. Like, just have so much grace for yourself, for your kids, for your parents, for your staff. Yeah, because right now we're just doing the best that we can. And just remember that we're all human. So thank you very much for bearing with me.
All right, well, if there aren't any questions, thank you. I see lots of what would sound like applause if we were all together, I'm sure, Lara. And, you know, I hadn't really put this together before today, but, you know, when you and I were teaching together, you know, we built our classroom around Glasser's work in choice theory and the conditions of quality. And as you were going through these things, I just thought about how this is really like 4.0 version of that.
Yes.
So that was really great to see.
Yes.
So thank you again for being here today and sharing your wisdom. And I know you'll be sharing resources with us as well. So we will make sure that we get those out to folks following the conference. So thank you.
My dog's having a nightmare.
I got a sitter for mine today.
Yeah, I will share my slides with everyone. And yeah, like I said, my contact information was on there, and Marcy and Beth have it. So any more follow-up that you want to, feel free to reach out and contact me. It's my favorite to talk about. So
great. Thank you so much. All right.